Hello YouTube. This is a video response to ShockOfGod's open challenge to atheists. Uh, I'd like to start by critiquing the way ShockOfGod issued his challenge. He's told atheists to prove their position. Well, atheism, as a negative proposition, doesn't need to be proven or disproven. Positive propositions are proven or disproven, and you assume the negative until you prove the positive. The fallacy here is there's no such thing as as having no position. The equivalent of having no position is assuming the negative proposition, and that's why you assume the negative proposition until you prove the positive. It's a logical law. It's been around since logical laws were codified. It's not an invention of atheists to have a cop-out. That is a logical law. Positive and negative propositions are not equal. If they were equal, it'd be literally impossible for you to have any position whatsoever, because you'd have to disprove an infinite number of negative propositions to take that position. Of course, that's impossible. For those of you familiar with the analogy of the flying spaghetti monster, that's what that's supposed to be an illustration of. Negative propositions are the default propositions. If any of you have ever taken statistics, you might have heard of the variable h0. That's what that's supposed to be equivalent to. For example, a person who's never conceived of religion, they're an atheist by default. That's an example of how you can't have no position. And Occam's razor is also in support of this. A negative proposition is simpler than a positive proposition, so you assume that according to the law of Occam's razor. Therefore, I'm not here to prove atheism. I'm here to cast doubt on religion, on specific religions, the concept of religion, the concept of God, etc. And there are three levels to why I am an atheist. They are the questions of whether God exists, whether specific gods exist, and if those gods did exist, why would I want to follow them, rather. We'll start with the question of the existence of God. To me, it appears a psychological phenomenon. Quite frankly, there are literally thousands of mutually exclusive religions out there that do exist, that have existed, and one must ask the question, how did they come about? Obviously, they're not all the result of divine revelations, because they're mutually exclusive. That means they cannot all be true at the same time. In fact, very few could be true at the same time as any of the others. They're mutually exclusive. So something else must explain where they come from. The obvious answer is a psychological phenomenon. And therefore, what are the odds of just one random one of these that are obviously all the result of psychological phenomenons? What are the odds just one of them just happens to be true? One of them genuinely is the result of divine revelation, and all the others just happen to rise about because of psychological phenomenon. And another point is there's simply no concrete evidence of God's presence. All religions have their stories of miracles and eyewitnesses of God's glory and grace or whatever. It's all on the same level. The miracle stories of a Christian are no more credible than the miracle stories of a Muslim or a Hindu or anything else like that. There's simply no concrete sign of God's presence. And now to the question of specific religions. There's a huge leap between accepting the existence of a god like a deist might, and actually accepting a specific god like a Muslim or a Christian might. There are inconsistencies and contradictions in the Bible, but I won't get into those in this video. That would require its own video. But to go back to the point of multitude of religions, why is any one religion more valid than the other? You have these thousands of alternatives, and if you're basing your beliefs on faith, why would you accept Christianity or Islam or Hinduism or any of those other ones when none of them sticks out much further than any of the others? They all are pretty much 100% speculation, as it were. There's no evidence for any of those specific religions more than any of the others. And this includes non-existent religions. Literally every logical permutation of reality is like a religion. It's no more likely that any of these non-existent religions are true than Christianity or anything like that. Um, the bottom line is choosing religion constitutes an arbitrary decision. Literally, you're just choosing a random belief, like a random text from a random person. In the case of like the Bible or the Koran, there's just this random document, and you choose to accept it as truth to the end of your being. You will refute any actual science or any other reason in the name of this random text that you chose. It is so backward. Faith believers could be forgiven about their faith belief if they just believe things where there was no indication one way or the other. I guess in the sense the ancients could be forgiven for their belief in gods, but instead the modern man likes to deny reason and science and anything else in the name of these faith-based beliefs. And worse yet, they use their faith-based arbitrary morals to judge others. Some even like to establish governmental policy based on these faith-based morals. And I think only people with reason-based morality have the right to judge other people if there ever was anybody. But the Christian God says, well, God's reason is higher than man's reason. Well, that's a great segue, actually, to me talking about whether, assuming these gods exist, would I even want to follow them? And what you say when you say that, you're saying, A, I should take a gamble and assume that this god's reason is higher than mine, and B, venerate this god even though they specifically created me as an inferior being with inferior reasoning. Obviously, any god who would do that wants you to be their servant, wants you to be their underling of some sort. A benevolent god would create an equal, not an underling, not a servant. To back up on that last point, it's a vile idea for a conscious, rational being to be created expressly for the purpose of being a servant. Even if that creator is some omnipotent being, it's still a vile concept to exist for the sake of serving another being. And any god that would create beings for this purpose is a malevolent god, an evil god. The qualities of rationality and consciousness together inherently imply a right to exist for your own sake, for your own purpose. And any god that would create you for any other reason is a malevolent one, should be disregarded. And if the reason of man is created inferior, it's a sign of the ill will of this god. That means God will have created man for the purpose of dominating man. And also, if God did create you with this inferior reasoning, but then expects you to follow him on blind faith, or else fry in hell for it, what kind of a God would do that kind of thing? Not to mention what kind of God would do all the things supposedly done to Job and all the other people who had their faith tested. Yeah, and even if this God is caring, it's unacceptable for them to treat conscious, rational beings as underlings, even if they have inferior reasoning, because that inferior reasoning is directly derived from that God. Religious morals in general are offensive, especially Christian and Muslim morals. They're vile and backwards. They condemn reason and intellect. Lean not on your own understanding. That's right from the Bible. They tell you to have faith. Deny your reason, deny your intellect, and accept faith. They condemn independence. They stress obedience to God, obedience to earthly authorities, being your brother's keeper. And in Islam, there's even explicit instructions to establish these morals as law. In Christianity, pacifism and resisting those that do you harm is another example of your independence being condemned by religious morals. And worst of all, they condemn self-interest. The Bible tells you to put God before yourself, to put your neighbor before yourself, to think of yourself last, to sacrifice yourself and your values for those of God and those of your neighbors. And though perhaps not biblical, other Christian and Muslim morals that I find offensive um, are the condemnation of bodily pleasures, especially when it comes to the very narrow view of sexuality. Premarital sex is bad. Being immodest is bad. Sexuality is terrible if it's exposed to children. You can't have it on TV. You can't talk about it in public. It's an adult issue. This is all the legacy of Christian thinking, even if they're not explicitly within the Bible. And in Islam, it's even worse. And I'd like to do a separate video on that specific topic, just because I find that to be one of the most backward things about